As you can imagine, there's a mountain of material flowing from the International AIDS Conference in Melbourne, Australia, and I'd like to make reference to 4 or 5 items that struck us as particularly interesting. First, there is something called the Global Burden of Disease Study, which appeared in the medical scientific journal The Lancet, published coincidentally with the International AIDS Conference. And it indicated that the number of people living with HIV is 29 million, rather than the figure which UNAIDS has been using of 35 million. Now, there were very large numbers of scientists who put together the 29 million figure, and it seems to be entirely authentic. So how does one account for the difference of 6 million? That's a huge number when you think of dealing with a pandemic down the road. And yet, at least as of this point, not a word from UNAIDS to explain the dissidence, the disparity. And number 2, there was, as many of you may have seen, a major study on sex work indicating that if we decriminalize sex work internationally, we would reduce the numbers of infections by 33 to 46% over 10 years. That can save hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions over the long term, from becoming infected. Indeed, number 3 is an extension of that. The hotshots at the conference postulated at one point that there were 5 high-risk groups who account for 50% of the new infections. And they were sex workers, and men who have sex with men, and injecting drug users, and transgendered, and prison populations. You'll notice what's missing. There's no identification of women who have always been so disproportionately infected. Of course, in the ambiguity with which these things are given, we see that UNICEF and UNAIDS came forward to say that 50% of all deaths over the last few years have occurred, a 50% increase, of all deaths in the last few years have occurred amongst adolescents. Adolescents defined as 10 to 19. I didn't know that 10-year-olds were adolescents, but then the UN is always given to these brilliant and revelatory moments. And finally, I should make reference to the study on injecting drug users, whose infection rate is climbing astronomically in both Eastern Europe and Russia because of the punitive behavior of the governments. But it also shows, the study from the conference, that only 7% of the required funding has been made available. Boy, that is deplorable. So in any event, turn to our website when you get a chance, because we're going to indicate the 10 most fascinating nuggets that emerged from the International AIDS Conference. And I want to assure you that women will be prominent amongst them, because it is maddening the way these statistical and arithmetic gurus always manage to analyze everything and miss the component of the pandemic which has been most vexing and horrifying: the vulnerability of women. That was last week. I'm Stephen Lewis.